In July 2021, archaeologists from AMS made international news with the discovery of a late Iron Age anthropomorphic notched figure from a riverside fen at Gortnacrannagh, County Roscommon, only a few kilometres from where we are today at the Rathcroghan Visitor Centre. The artefact, almost 3 metres long and carved from oak, is one of only about 20 such objects to have been found in Ireland. And a sample of wood taken from the object yielded a quite late date of Cal AD 252 to 413. This late date, just centuries before the arrival of St. Patrick in Ireland, places our figure towards the end of the Irish Iron Age, providing us with a glimpse of the beliefs and practices in Ireland on the eve of conversion. Beyond its rarity and late date, the figure is significant because of the really rich archaeological context in which it was found. Excavations at Gortnacrannagh lasted over a year, uncovering a really complex shoreline site with evidence for several millennia of activity, including occupation, burial, craftworking, agriculture, and perhaps most interestingly, the sustained deposition of selected artefacts, human remains and animal remains into the water. This was a liminal watery place where communities came together to interact with other realms and other beings. So my aim today is to give you an overview of the archaeology of Gortnacrannagh 7. It's going to be sort of a here's what I dug last summer type talk. And I suppose I want to do that just to kind of set up for the rest of our specialists here today. And I'm really open to, if there's any kind of threads or parts people want more information on, we can discuss those in the Q&A. So first of all, to locate ourselves. Gortnacrannagh, for those of you particularly tuning in online, is in North County Roscommon. And it's located between Tusk and Elf. Oh, sorry. There we go. between Tusk, where we are today, and Elphin, just 6 kilometres northeast of the prehistoric royal site of Rathcroghan. So coming down from the rich limestone plateau where the royal site and its complex is, the site lies in a landscape of drumlins, fen and bog and streams on the eastern boundary of the territory of Moynee, as we will discuss by Daniel Curley in his paper later today. So just to reiterate, here's the site located on the Owenor River, and here we have the complex of Rathcroghan. The site lies on a south-facing ridge overlooking the Owenor River. The river rises here in the Clune Lakes, and it has quite an interesting topography. So it flows west around this drumlin before taking a sharp turn east and flowing on towards the Shannon. As Daniel is going to discuss later, one of the tributaries of the river rises quite close to the royal site of Rathcroghan, and that may perhaps be significant. And one of the boundaries, the historically documented boundaries of the territory of Moynee, is located very close to the site here at Ballyslish Bridge. The significance of the river is also well testified by some of the archaeological finds that have been retrieved from its depths over the years. And in particular, I want to note several human skulls that have been taken from the river. So within close proximity to the site, which is here, we have at least 3 human skulls that have come out of the river. And my thanks to Sean Neary for providing me with this image of one of the skulls and additional information. We also have a series of archaeological monuments along the banks of the river, including several mounds of possible prehistoric date that could have been part of its sacralization or part of broader landscapes associated with the watercourse. So it's a special river in some respects, and that can help us to think about the location of the site. While today the landscape has been thoroughly drained and the river has been deepened and straightened, in antiquity this was a much more dynamic wetland landscape. We might imagine the meandering Owenor River flanked by rushy peat flowing towards a now filled in lake to the east of the site. Braided paleo channels from the river cut through the fen towards stagnant pools of water reflecting back the sky. And in this drone image, we can have a good sense of the landscape. So the site is here on this glacial ridge. To the east of the site, we have this large area of fen peat, the site of a former lake. And you can see the river, which in the post-famine period was very thoroughly straightened and drained. And just here across the river from the site is the site of one of those possible prehistoric mounds. The image in the bottom of the slide is of the pollen core taken by Karen Malloy, just immediately east of the site. And you can see the thick layers of lake marl visible in the core, indicating that dynamic wetland history. In the next talk, Ben Geary is going to tell us a little bit more about the environmental context. And we hope that the rich insect assemblage from the site, which is going to be looked at by Steve Davis, and the pollen assemblage, which will be analysed by Karen Malloy, is going to really help us to tease out the full environmental context of the remains that we found. So the excavated area at Gortnacrannagh comprised of three main areas. Area 1, the dry land, had evidence of activity from the late Neolithic to the post-medieval period. Area 2, the eastern wetland, had evidence for Neolithic deposition of pottery, but its main feature was a single east-west brushwood trackway of probable Iron Age date. Area 3, the southern wetlands, also had evidence for Neolithic activity, followed by a series of Bronze Age and Iron Age platforms, which were located parallel to the shore. So the earliest clear phase of activity at the site is during the Neolithic, and the later Neolithic in particular. On the dry land, there's evidence for occupation in the form of pits and post holes associated with grooved ware pottery, and a possible pit alignment is located parallel to the shore. We also have an extensive lithic scatter, you can see the dots there, across the dry land, including fragments of a polished stone axe. Wetland deposition is an evidence from the Neolithic with the placement of grooved ware pottery into the wetland. We also have the deposition of shale cores and lithics, and a saddle quern possibly from this period have been placed into the water. And you can see here along the site of a former paleo channel, we had a concentration of over 40 sherds of grooved ware pottery. This grooved ware pottery has been provisionally identified by Owen Grogan as coming from a single vessel. And this very much is marking the start of our tradition of wetland deposition at Gortnacrannagh in the late Neolithic period. And this is a tradition that would last for millennia, so from the late Neolithic all the way through to the early medieval period. So, as Ross will discuss in a subsequent talk, there's evidence for early Bronze Age activity close to the site in the form of a really rare and exotic jet bead from a necklace that may derive from a burial somewhere close to the site. Clear evidence for Bronze Age activity is also found in Area 1 and the dry land, and Area 3 in the wetland. On the dry land, this comes in the form of a fairly denuded burnt spread with underlying pits and other features. And this is located on the interface of the glacial till and the glaze more associated with the wetlands, so just around here. And immediately north of this, we have a penannular ring ditch of probable Bronze Age date, very closely spatially associated with it. The ditch contained very small token quantities of burnt cremated bone, animal bone and lithics, but possibly our most interesting find was a fragment of a clay mould for non-ferrous metalworking. The Bronze Age was also a very busy time in the wetland, and some of our most interesting archaeology from the wetland comes from this period. In Area 3, the southern wetland, this is represented by a very large stone surface that was made just inside the wetland margin, overlying marl and accumulated fen peat. And you can see here, this is just pictures of the area under excavation. So we had it divided up into 10-metre strips for the purposes of excavation. And this is an image of sections, through the stone surfaces. So these are the stone surfaces. And you can see the peat and the marl underlying. So this is creating a really nice firm surface for activity on what would have been a quite soft and boggy part of wetland previous to that. The stone surface covered an extensive area of about 30 metres by 17 metres east-west. A structure made of 4 identical roundwood posts with probable late Bronze Age tool marks on them is pushed down through the stone layers. And at the moment, I'm not really sure what this structure is, but it certainly helps us to date the surface, and I'm pretty confident this is around late Bronze Age in date. We have a second roundwood structure immediately off the stone surface, and this again is of unclear date, but it's very similar in size to the other structure. So interesting kind of wooden structures associated with the surface. And here are those 2 features under excavation. And in this image, you can see how the large posts have been pushed down through the stone surface. The stone surface was overlain by 2 large wooden platforms here and here. And these were composed of roundwood, brushwood and stone piled up on top of the earlier structures. And here are some images of those structures being excavated. And you can see in this image the stone and the wood all piled up together to form the surface. And these platforms had fragments of hurdles overlying them in places. Although the wood survival in Gortnacrannagh isn't amazing because of the extensive drainage, so the upper layers were often not very well survived, but we did have some parts that were quite nice, like here. We also have evidence of 2 trackways in this area in Gortnacrannagh in Area 3. And these are of unclear date, but based on some of the stratigraphy, I suspect they might be Iron Age, and a full programme of radiocarbon dating will help us to phase and tease out the different chronologies in this part of the site. So we found a really rich assemblage of artefacts, human remains and animal remains in and on the structures in this area. And this suggests some of the activities that might have been carried out. And the assemblage, and while I mentioned there's underlying Neolithic material underneath the stone platforms, but the assemblage associated with the later structures is very much late Bronze Age to Iron Age in date. So we have 2 portions of identified human bone from this area. So both of them consisting of human cranial fragments, so parts of the skull. And the first of these consists of a fragment of a human skull, which presumably has come from a body deposited elsewhere. And this was buried into the fabric of the stone surface, the stone platform itself, quite close to the skull of a dog. And it's tempting to think that these might constitute a foundational deposit of sorts, as is quite common in a Bronze Age context. We also had a second, more intact human skull located at a slight remove from the structures. And here we have an image of it in situ. And this was found at the base of the piece overlying the gravelly, the natural kind of gravel underneath the piece. And the fact that this was lying on top of the gravel, we think that it was deposited into open water or very kind of loose, kind of soupy fen. And as I've already mentioned, we have an existing tradition of depositing heads into the Aunur River, and I think this can be read as part of that continuing tradition. Arguably, the most significant find from the site is the Iron Age anthropomorphic wooden figure, which is going to be discussed in more detail by Kathy later on today. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about where it was found and how this might relate back to the other structures. So the figure was found face down in really well humified fen peat at a short remove, so about 10 metres away from the main area of archaeological activity. It's likely to have originally stood upright somewhere within the archaeological complex, but as yet I haven't identified a likely spot. So I haven't found a very large post hole or a specific place where it may have been, and we're still considering the options of where it may have originally been positioned. But it does seem quite likely that at the end of its life, and that could have transpired in a number of ways, the object was taken down and deliberately deposited in this place in natural fen peat at a remove from the main archaeological structures. It's in pretty bad nick, as Kathy's going to talk about, and I think this is largely due to the fact that, as we've already discussed, the peat in the site has been very thoroughly drained, so it's probably been subject to repeated episodes of wetting and drying over the course of its buried life in this part of the fen. So I'm now going to move on to talk about some of the other objects that we found here. So many of the objects retrieved from the peat at this part of the site can certainly be thought of as what Mel Giles has really beautifully termed everyday treasures. So that is worn objects made special by their long use and biographies. These are objects that very much formed part of the fabric of everyday domestic and agricultural life in prehistory before being specially selected for deposition into this special place. So we have, for example, part of the ard from a plough, and this is one of only 2 artifacts that we've had dated so far, and this has yielded again Iron Age dates of Cal AD 80 to 214, and it's made out of ash, and this was found in peat close to the shoreline. Other finds include wooden vessel fragments. So here we have a very worn lid from a wooden vessel and part of a wooden butter churn, quite interestingly. And we also have a number of the typical mysterious carved batons or sticks that are so often found in wetland sites. And these 2 examples are beautifully carved wooden batons with beautiful symmetrical ends, and interestingly they're very similar to an artifact that was found by Cathy Moore at the extraordinary wetland site of Iderclune in County Longford in a Bronze Age context. So some really interesting patterns there that Cathy and I will be able to unpick. Several finds from Area 3 can be categorised as objects of bodily adornment, or perhaps regalia, intimate objects worn on the body but past peoples, perhaps for certain roles or certain times or certain activities. So here are some of the our most glamorous example is probably this beautiful late Bronze Age disc-headed pin. And if you'll note on the top of the pin, we have this wonderful concentric decoration. We also have this smaller copper alloy penannular ring, and possibly a finger ring, but more work to be done on that. Some of my favourite objects from the site are these wonderful pendants. So we have 2 boar tusk pendants with clear perforation holes for wearing, as well as a bone pendant. And just to note that boar tusks are in certain Bronze Age contexts are very much associated with regalia or certain ceremonial outfits. So it's tempting to speculate if that is the case in Gortnacrannagh, for example. And in Ireland in the Bronze Age, they're very often included in burials. So they're quite potent objects in a sense. And the boar, of course, was renowned for its ferocity and its courage as an animal. So very interesting objects. This is perhaps my favourite artefact from the site. It's an iron dagger, which was found on the surface of the stone platforms in Area 3, very close to a matching bone handle. And also to note, there was 2 whetstones found in very close proximity to this, and I would very much interpret these as all being related. The morphology of the dagger is very similar to modern sticking knives that are used to slaughter domestic animals by severing the carotid artery and the jugular vein. And there is very strong evidence in the form of a very large animal bone assemblage that was its function. The animal bone assemblage is perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of Gortnacrannagh. It firmly puts animals back into the tradition of wetland deposition in Ireland, and it allows us to think about what's missing from other wetland sites, where acidic bog conditions did not allow for the preservation of bone, or where antiquarians perhaps dismissed bone as not important to the artefacts they were more interested in. This map shows the distribution of bone from Gortnacrannagh, and all of the black dots represent bone samples that have been recorded by GPS. The bone assemblage from Gortnacrannagh included fully articulated animals, so essentially animal burials, partially articulated animals, and disarticulated animals and butchered remains. So we have, for example, a deer burial, you can see here, and at least 3 full dog burials. Partially articulated animal remains include several articulated cattle and sheep goat, which are quite difficult to differentiate in the fields, sheep goat heads. So And you can see this is one of the nicest examples. So in this case, what we essentially have is a decapitated cow. So we find the top part of the skull, we find the jaws, and we find a couple of the top vertebrae. So this is a decapitated cow's head that's been buried into the archaeological structures. Large quantities of disarticulated and or butchered bone were found scattered across and within the archaeological structures in all parts of the wetland. I think that the patterning in the bone distribution is suggestive of animal sacrifice, a really widely documented practice which often involves the burial or deposition of elements of the carcass, with the remainder being consumed by the community in feasting. So part for the gods and part for the community. That this liminal place was selected as the appropriate location to carry out the charged task of animal slaughter, perhaps ritualized as sacrifice, is surely significant. And preliminary results from the insect analysis by Steve Davis has indicated that there's evidence of beetles associated with animal dung on these platforms. So it does suggest there are live animals being brought down here in the Bronze and the Iron Age, which would feed into that interpretation. The presence of both wild and domestic animals within these animal depositions is notable, and the presence of deer and possibly boar is indicative of hunting, an activity which Liz Fitzpatrick, talking about the medieval period, has argued was characteristic of wilderness boundary landscapes, playing a role in the reinforcement of boundary claims. And that theme of boundary is something that's going to come up again during the day. A small assemblage of bone tools and objects were also found in this area. And while the typology of some of these is as yet unclear, and we're trying to figure out exactly what they were, we can identify bone pins, bone awls, and a bone scraper of a type that's often associated with leatherworking. And along with a nice corpus of flint scrapers from this area and in these layers, we do have some suggestions that maybe hide or leatherworking was being carried out here. And I think this would actually work quite well with an interpretation that it's a place where animals were being slaughtered. And that's going to be one of the questions we very much ask the zoo archaeologists when they're carrying out the assemblage of this from the sites. Like, are there other pieces of evidence for that? And here are two more bone artefacts, which give us a bit of a sense of the variety of material culture available. And as yet, we're not sure what these are. A perforated bone disc. We originally thought this was leather, but it's actually bone, and another lovely carved bone object. So just to give you a sense. So now I'm going to move on to talk about Niall Jones is in the audience there. Niall Jones's area. He supervised that area. So the Area 2 trackway. The main feature in Area 2 was a trackway placed perpendicular to the shore, heading out into the deepest part of the piece towards the former lake. This trackway was largely made from brushwood with a substructure made of large horizontal roundwoods that had been pinned into place with pegs and posts. The substructure was most evident in the eastern part of the trackway, where the underlying peat was much deeper and softer, and it sort of needed that extra support. A series of vertical posts with probable Iron Age tool marks have been thrust down through the trackway, and again these are more concentrated towards the eastern end of the structure, maybe forming some kind of structural role or helping to hold it together. And at the moment, we very much think that this structure is Iron Age, and again, the dating programme will help to confirm this. The location and orientation of the trackway strongly suggests that it was not built as a structure to cross the wetland in any functional sense, but rather served to provide access to the deepest part of the fen. It led straight into the liminal zone, and here between land and water, realms could be crossed and otherworldly powers approached. And that's an interpretation that I'm sort of bringing from some of the artefacts, special deposits we found within this trackway. Like the Area 3 platforms, this trackway had artefacts, human remains and animal remains embedded within its fabric. Again, we're confronted with the everyday treasures. So we have, for example, a small socketed iron knife. This beautiful iron blade with a wooden handle, and there's a curve on the blade, so it may be a sickle or part of a billhook with connotations of harvest, I think, that are quite interesting. We have a number of bone pins from the trackway. Here is a selection of the wooden artifacts that were found buried into the structure. So we have a small yoke that would have been carried, by a human, maybe for carrying bundles of brushwood. A non-identified perforated plank. Another, again, we're in the realm of the mysterious sticks. This a beautiful piece of a dressed plank here. And the usual selection of wooden vessels. So we have here this kind of plain one, and this is perhaps the most beautiful wooden vessel from this trackway, which it's got a beautiful carved cylindrical handle, and it's quite small in dimensions, but it's reminiscent in form with some of the wooden cauldrons from the Iron Age that Caroline Earwood has published and written about. An iron-socketed projectile embedded into the trackway at a 45-degree angle reminds us of the performative gestures that accompanied the placement of these archaeological objects. And I think that we can imagine somebody casting this projectile into the trackway at a remove, possibly embedded in some other kind of broader rituals at the structure. A single wooden item buried within the trackway is of unambiguous ritual significance. It is the head of a second, smaller anthropomorphic figure. This time, in a very dramatic act of decommissioning, the figure has been decapitated. So this is Kathy's interpretation based on her analysis of the tool marks on the figure. And this decapitated figure is one of a number of head fragments. I think there's a very much theme of head fragments buried within this trackway. So we have this figure's head, but we also have human skull fragments and quite a few animal heads, all buried together within the trackway. So 7 human skull fragments have been found within the fabric of the trackway. And the number of individuals represented is at the moment unclear because they haven't been analysed by the bone specialist, but initial on-site inspection by Dr Claire Mullins has confirmed that there are at least juveniles and adults present. So she identified one fragment as a child under the age of 2, and other fragments were definitely from adults. As I previously mentioned, we also have large quantities of animal bone found within the fabric of this trackway. And again, as we've seen, these include fully articulated, semi-articulated and disarticulated remains. The torso of a large mammal was found within the substructural layers of the trackway, perhaps foundational deposit made when the trackway was built. We have at least 2 fully articulated dogs deposited off the northern edge of the trackway. We can see one of the examples here. And this particular skull, as you can see, the dog was dispatched by a sharp blow to the cranium. So this I'm interpreting as a sacrificed dog that has been placed off the trackway. A series of animal heads, including articulated and non-articulated, were placed throughout the fabric of the trackway. And these include some really interesting examples. So we have the head of a stag with very large antlers. So we have 16 tines on these antlers, which would have make it a monarch, I think, in deer parlance. And we also have, quite close to this was found, a decapitated horse. And then we had the usual array of cattle heads and a few sheep goat heads. My current interpretation is that at least some of the animal heads, the human skull fragments and some of the artifacts formed part of a composite deposit, perhaps even made in a single episode. Both the stag and the horse are very symbolically charged animals, and they occur again in different kind of motifs throughout this period. I'm thinking of some of the Armagh statues from Armagh Cathedral, for example, and of course we can think of dog symbolism, or all the work that's been done on the horse, or the horse goddess, or Macha, and all that kind of material. And of course, with the dogs, we might think, again, these are obviously later medieval references, but Cuchulainn. So the whole rich body of lore on the significance of these different animals and how they're used to think with, and how they're being used in really kind of complex ways in this context. The stag is really interesting. It allows us to think about seasonality, because it is only in the winter parts of the year that stags would have these really large antlers, and we can start to approach issues of seasonality through the animal remains, and that's something we very much want to do when our full analysis has been completed. Patching, it's important to note that there was evidence of patching on the upper layer of the trackway, so this does indicate that it was used through time, and of course there may have been repeated episodes of deposition within its fabric. Parallel activity, a possible Iron Age date, was also identified on the dry land. When the ring ditch had silted up, a small timber circle was built on top of it, and this is of unclear date, but it may be Iron Age, and you should be able to see it in this drone ortho image. So there it is, just overlying the earlier ring ditch, and here it is on the smaller image here. So this is probably Iron Age, but it could be a little bit earlier to maybe late Bronze Age. Immediately south of the ring ditch, there is evidence for undated ironworking. A gully that contained a possible smithing hearth was found in association with fragments of slag, including 2 fragments of smithing hearth cake and possible smelting slag. These have been identified by Paul Rondeles using from photographs. So the significance of ironworking in this funerary context associated with the ring ditch is something that many scholars have talked about, and ironworking again is of huge symbolic importance in the Iron Age. So the continued relevance of the ring ditch is noted by the presence of a single east-west burial associated just beside it, and the continued importance of some of the wetland material is indicated by this beautiful artifact, which is an early medieval ring-headed pin, and this was deposited on top of the trackway in Area 2, and this bookends our wetland deposition in the early medieval period. So we have from the grooved ware to this medieval ring-headed pin. Just finishing up, in the later medieval period, the archaeological signature at the site is very much geared towards agriculture. So we have this lovely corn drying kiln of probable late medieval date and other associated features. And this may be related with an adjacent moated site. So as we go into the later medieval period, we very much see that the focus has shifted away from Gortnacrannagh as a place of ritual and a place of deposition, and the focus is clearly shifting in as we come into the Christian era to adjacent sites such as Shankill and Elphin. So to finish with Idols and Unclean Things, the title of our conference, it is of course a quote from St. Patrick in his Confessio, when he lamented that the Irish knew nothing of God but worshipped only idols and unclean things. And given the dates of the material from Gortnacrannagh, it's very tempting to speculate that he could have been talking about figures such as these in the Irish landscape. As for the unclean things, as the post-ex continued, we're gaining more of an insight into them, and we will hopefully learn more about this broader context throughout the day. Yes, I always habitually a little trauma warning for the people who are on the site here. I always like to finish my talks on Gortnacrannagh with a few shots of the extensive flooding, freezing, rain, COVID that we endured as we excavated that site. And I do so because just to really reiterate that excavating a site like Gortnacrannagh is a huge team effort, and I'm just but one member of a much broader team. So I'd just like to extend my huge thanks to everybody who's involved, to Colm Hardy in particular, to all the supervisors, all the excavators, Deirdre and all the people at the TII, because it's, you know, as I say, it's very much a group effort. And as we go forward, all my colleagues who've been working with in the post-ex. So yes, so thank you very much. And yeah, thank you.